There is one big idea that I want you to take away from this lesson. The Ten Commandments are more than keeping rules. They are about relationships, our relationship with God and our relationship with others. With the arrival of the Israelites at Mount Sinai, we reach a high point of the book of Exodus, for it is here that Israel will transition from a ragtag group of escaped slaves into a nation. Without question, the most famous of Israel's law codes is the Ten Commandments. It is Israel's most important founding document, its national charter. God did not give the Ten Commandments to be oppressive. Every nation needs laws to govern themselves, and this was equally true with Israel. There are about a dozen candidates for Mount Sinai, as seen by the green triangles on this map. However, for the past 1,500 years, many Christians and Jews have regarded Jebel Musa, Arabic for Mount Moses, as the true Mount Sinai. The core legal collection that God gave Israel at Mount Sinai appears in pink. There is the Decalogue in Exodus 20, better known as the Ten Commandments, and the Covenant Code in Exodus 21 to 23. The Ten Commandments are the principles that govern all of Israel's other laws, while the Covenant Code contains practical laws governing daily life. It might be helpful to think of the Decalogue as Israel's constitution, and the Covenant Code as Israel's Bill of Rights. Taken together, these two laws are commonly called the Sinai Covenant or the Mosaic Covenant. Framing the legal corpus are the blue blocks that set the stage for Israel to receive the covenant and what happens afterwards. Before Israel can receive the Sinai Covenant, the people must prepare themselves spiritually and agree in principle to accept its terms before God gives it. Thus, Israel has a choice to either accept or reject God's offer. If they accept it, then God will present the Decalogue in chapter 20. If they reject it, then they are free to return to Egypt. As chapter 19, verse 8 indicates, the people agreed to follow the covenant. However, even after the covenant has been given, Israel must ratify it. In other words, now that they know the terms, Israel must reaffirm their commitment to follow it. This gives the people a second chance to reject God's offer and return to Egypt. But in chapter 24, verse 3, the people proclaim, "Everything Yahweh has said, we will do." Thus Israel is now bound to the covenant. Remember, the Sinai covenant is all about relationships, a two-way relationship. As in a marriage, both parties must work together to make the relationship work. The most memorable event of the preparation in Exodus 19 is when God settles on the summit of the mountain in a dense cloud amidst lightning, thunder, and the blast of a trumpet. This is a theophany, a stunning manifestation of God. Remember, a theophany is when God clothes himself in natural phenomena, as with the burning bush, or when guiding Israel through the wilderness in a cloud by day and in a pillar of fire at night. Let us now move on to the Decalogue. Most people know the Decalogue better as the Ten Commandments. The term Decalogue comes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd century BCE. In Greek, deca means 10 and logos means word. Thus, Decalogue means 10 words, as reflected in the opening verse in Hebrew. Then God spoke all these words. Here are the 10 words or sayings, conditions that Israel must fulfill in order to be in relationship with God. The first 4 stipulations are theological and govern our vertical relationship with God. First is the command not to show disloyalty by worshiping other gods alongside Yahweh, and not to use idols in worship. God then asks Israel not to misuse God's name and to observe the Sabbath. The last 6 stipulations are sociological laws that govern our horizontal relationship with others. Note how the first one is to honor one's father and mother. After this are the commands not to murder, referring to premeditated murder or manslaughter, not to commit adultery, referring to both married and unmarried people, not to steal, not to lie about others in a court of law, which is the human equivalent of the third commandment, and finally, not to wrongly desire that which is yours, not yours. Jesus acknowledged the vertical and horizontal dimensions when he was asked which commandment was the greatest. Jesus began by citing Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is that vertical dimension. Jesus then goes on to quote Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the horizontal dimension. Now, here is an interesting question. Where was Moses when God gave the 10 Commandments? Most will say on the summit of Mount Sinai, since this is what shows up in the movies. But if one takes the time to read the last verse in chapter 19 and the first verse of chapter 20 closely, it is apparent that Moses is not on the mountain. He is at the foot of the mountain with the people. Furthermore, there is nothing about God delivering the 10 Commandments on 2 tablets. Instead, we read how God spoke all these words. The written version of the Decalogue comes 11 chapters later at the end of Exodus 31. Thus, the movies have conflated an extremely complex series of events spanning 13 chapters into a single episode. Let us move on to the Covenant Code, the practical application of the Decalogue, Israel's Bill of Rights. There are 2 kinds of legal formulations in the Bible, and both types appear in the Covenant Code. The first is apodictic law, also called incontestable law. What God says, one must do without question. These laws are set forth in the familiar you shall or you shall not form. Apodictic law is unique to ancient Israel and not found in any other ancient Near Eastern law code. Casuistic law is called case law today. It uses the expression if, then, and sometimes when, then. This kind of law requires a judge's decision in a court of law. As with the Covenant Code, casuistic law is found throughout the Bible and in all ancient Near Eastern law codes, including the well-known Code of Hammurabi. Let's test your knowledge about which one is which. At the top we read, if or when someone's ox hurts the ox of another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the price of it. And the dead animal they shall also divide. If you guessed casuistic or case law, then you are correct, as seen in the if-then formulation. The second example reads, you shall be people consecrated to me. Therefore, you shall not eat any meat that is mangled by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. If you guessed apodictic law, then you are correct, since like the Decalogue, you have the you shall and you shall not formulation. According to Exodus 24, verses 3 through 7, both law codes, the Decalogue and the Covenant Code, comprise the Book of the Covenant. This is because Moses writes down both the words and the ordinances of Yahweh in a book. The words would be the stipulations of the Decalogue. The ordinances would be the laws of the Covenant Code. Some scholars equate the covenant code with just the covenant code, or the book of the covenant with just the covenant code. However, in our class, we will regard the book of the covenant as both the Decalogue and the covenant code. One more item before we close. Are the Ten Commandments still relevant for Christians today? First, nowhere does Jesus exempt us from following the Ten Commandments, and most would agree that its moral values are relevant to every society. Second, whenever Jesus comments on the law, he is clear that its observance is not legalistic, but a matter of the heart, which, by the way, is precisely the same message promulgated by the rabbis of Jesus' day and even rabbis today. It's not about rules, it's about the heart and relationships. Finally, most New Testament polemic against observance of the law is not against the law per se, but against its misuse. We now conclude our lesson.